Yes, it's a big one. So what are your, don't hold anything back for the podcast's sake. Like, what are your thoughts on what's going on with ADHD and how we even kind of,
Well,
understand it?
well, well, of course, ADHD is a whole new disorder. It didn't exist when I was a kid because we never diagnosed it. So I think that, so let me qualify what I'm going to say a little bit. I'm sure that there is some very tiny percentage of the population who does have inborn characteristic that is really difficult for them in all of life. I think so. I think there is such a thing as being
Yeah.
at the extreme on this, but it's not. In the United States, the last I looked, 20% of boys were getting a diagnosis of ADHD at some point during their
Yeah.
primary and secondary school career. No way does it make sense that 20% of boys have a mental disorder that we should be calling a disorder. We should simply be recognizing that there's a whole range of, I think that primarily, although you're right that, ADHD is in some sense a constellation of things, especially since we've collapsed the two diagnoses. So that what used to be separated between ADD and ADHD, we've collapsed the two. That it's a number of things, but primarily it's impulsiveness. So we human beings vary in the degree to which we tend to be impulsive, to which we tend to really leap into things that grab our attention and are interesting to us, as opposed to the degree that we are capable and willing to just really focus on a single thing over time. And you can make the evolutionary argument, and I have made it in some of my writing, but so have others, that, historically, almost all of human life was done in groups. Problems were solved in groups. Hunter-gatherers hunted in groups. And you wanted people with a range of different abilities. You wanted some people who were just really focused on those animal tracks, studying them carefully, not distracted by anything else. You
Yeah.
wanted other people who noticed the tiger who was creeping up behind you, or saw, oh, there's a fat eland over there. Why worry about these tracks? There's an eland over there. So you wanted some people who would have the characteristics that we now might call ADHD, and we wanted other people who have the characteristics that we might now call the characteristics of a scholar, the kind of person who becomes a professor, or, all those kinds of things, right? We want all those people. I think we still want all of those people.
We
But it
do.
turns out, if you're the kind of person who notices the tiger, you're not going to do well in school.
Yeah.
This school isn't the proper environment for you. And school has become less and less the proper environment for you over time. So it used to be, back in the days when teachers could adapt what they were doing, they could adjust to these kids. They could accommodate them in one way or another, more or less. Not perfectly. But now they can't accommodate them. So the only thing they can do is diagnose them as having a disorder because they're not fitting into what's doing in school. Almost all diagnoses of ADHD originate in school. The diagnosis is not done by school, but the originator who says, you need to have your child assessed for ADHD is school. Nowadays, of course, there are parents searching for that diagnosis, doctor shopping until they find somebody who'll give their kid that diagnosis. Why? Because they get special accommodations in school if they do go to school. But you have to have the diagnosis to get the accommodations. You can't just accommodate because you recognize everybody's different and so on and so forth. So that also drives the increase in diagnosis of ADHD. Then, of course, there is profit to be made. Drug companies are pushing diagnosis and have for a long time. There's a parents' advocacy group for diagnosis of their parents of kids who have ADHD, an advocacy group that is quite militant in saying this is a real disorder, it needs to be treated, and so forth. Well, that parenting group, it turns out to be funded by the drug companies that are making making the drugs that are being used to treat it. So there's
Mm.
economic interest in this. There's a way for schools to justify the fact that so many kids are not succeeding in school. It's not because the school isn't succeeding, it's because they've got a disorder. So I think all of that is playing into it. I think there's very little to be gained by giving these disorders. It, although I'm sympathetic to parents who are looking for the diagnosis because they want to keep their kid in the public school, and this will give them this will give the school a reason to make a special accommodations for their kid. But I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think, you know, I don't even like the term neurodiversity. And I know there are a lot of people who are going to argue with me about this and even be offended by my saying that. But we're all different. Every one of us is different. You are different from me. You have different interests, different abilities than I
Yeah.
do. I have
So
different
stating the
interests and
obvious, right?
abilities from my own brothers.
Mm.
What we need to do is value our differences and find ways to create learning environments and environments generally where people can learn to understand themselves, understand who they are, and develop in the way that works best for them. And there's nobody who knows what works best for them than the person themselves. That's why self-directed education, which I've long been an advocate of, works so well, especially for those kids who have characteristics that are different enough from average that they just don't fit into the public school system. They just in the way public schooling is done today. They find their ways of learning, and they also, even maybe more important, they discover what their strengths are, and then they go on into careers that are in their strengths. So there are some kinds of jobs, for example, where having these impulsive ADHD characteristics are actually an advantage. My wife, who is an OBGYN, claims that for somebody working in an emergency room or somebody working in an obstetrics room, this quality is a valuable quality. She claims she has that quality, and I think she does to some degree. She can jump from one thing to another. She can get fully involved in it, and yet in what she's doing, and yet notice the other things and be drawn to them when she needs to be drawn. I have a stepson who was diagnosed, who clearly has the symptoms of ADHD to the degree that where they're diagnosed today, who suffered through public school. His biological father wouldn't allow him to leave it. So he suffered through public school, barely passed, but he decided afterwards that he was interested in becoming a chef. And he went on and was very successful as a chef. A chef does very well with these characteristics. You've got to keep all these things going. You've got to keep tabs of so many different things. You have to be willing to jump from one thing to another as you're going through this. I think people who are emergency responders, fire
Yeah.
off,
People who deal with high stress, right?
people who
It's
deal with high stress, who have to
yeah.
jump into emergency situations and just jump right in and don't sit back and think about it too long.
Yeah.
We need people in those kinds of careers. But we've got a system where we think that we act as if everybody's supposed to be a scholar, like everybody's supposed to be willing to spend hours and hours studying something that for the great majority of people is not very interesting.
Mm. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for explaining that well. It's good that I hear someone just speak their truth, and even know if it's going to offend people, there's not enough of that. It's refreshing. There's too many people playing it safe, and that's what makes these things worse in a way, because we all need to express what we feel, and it needs to be that for a conversation to happen, right? For a dialogue. So yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, how are you remaining upbeat? How have you remained upbeat? You seem quite, still curious, still eager to learn and also be wrong, but also just express. And yeah, your work's continuing. So it's like how are you staying upbeat and connected to this mission?